Hey guys, tonight we begin with whispered prayers in candlelit chambers where holy water dripped from trembling fingers and Latin incantations echoed through stone corridors. Because while the medieval ages left behind magnificent cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts, they also left behind something far more unsettling: detailed records of demonic possession, elaborate exorcism rituals, and the desperate struggle between faith and forces that medieval minds could barely comprehend. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys through history's shadowed corners. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us as we explore these darker chapters of the past. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle for atmosphere, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of medieval demonology together. When the sun set over a medieval village, darkness brought more than just the absence of light. It carried with it whispers of ancient fears, unexplained behaviors, and spiritual terrors that plagued communities from the Scottish Highlands to the Italian countryside. In an age where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was gossamer thin, demons weren't just theological concepts. They were daily realities that could possess your neighbor, corrupt your children, or drive entire communities to the brink of madness. The medieval understanding of demons drew from a tapestry of ancient sources that had been woven together over centuries. Greek philosophy had planted the earliest seeds, where Homer himself had once equated demons with gods, using the words daimon and theos as synonyms. But as centuries passed, thinkers like Hesiod began to see demons differently, not as divine beings, but as the departed souls of men who had lived in the Golden Age, wandering between worlds with unfinished business and sometimes malevolent intent. Pythagoras took this concept even further, believing that the soul of any person became a demon when separated from the body at death. To him, a demon was simply a bodiless soul, neither inherently good nor evil, but existing in a liminal space between mortality and eternity. This Greek foundation would prove crucial, as later Christian theologians struggled to understand exactly what these entities were and how they fit into their emerging worldview. Jewish apocryphal literature added another layer to the demonic tapestry, introducing concepts of fallen angels and rebellious spirits that had been cast out of heaven. Biblical doctrine provided the framework for understanding possession and the power of faith to combat evil forces. But perhaps most intriguingly, pagan Germanic folklore contributed elements that would make medieval demons uniquely terrifying. The ability to inhabit forests, storms, and wild places where civilization's light couldn't reach. By the time medieval Christianity had fully formed, demons had evolved into complex entities that existed at the intersection of theology, medicine, and social control. They weren't simply evil spirits. They were explanations for the unexplainable, scapegoats for society's failures, and sometimes, paradoxically, sources of compassion for those suffering from what we might now recognize as mental illness. In the rolling hills of 13th century Bavaria, a young woman named Bertha began exhibiting behaviors that terrified her family and neighbors. She would speak in voices that weren't her own, contort her body in impossible ways, and demonstrate knowledge of Latin scripture despite being unable to read. Her parents, devout farmers who had never encountered anything like this, turned to the only authority they trusted, the church. Father Wilhelm, the parish priest, had served his community for over 2 decades. He had baptized Bertha as an infant, watched her grow into a pious young woman, and could hardly reconcile the thrashing, screaming creature before him with the gentle soul he had known. But medieval priests were trained for such moments. They understood that the world was locked in an eternal struggle between good and evil, and that sometimes that battle was fought in the bodies and minds of the faithful. The process of determining whether someone was truly possessed was both art and science in medieval times. Father Wilhelm began with careful observation and questioning. Was the afflicted person speaking in languages they had never learned? Did they demonstrate supernatural strength? Could they reveal hidden knowledge or prophecy? Most importantly, did they react violently to holy objects, blessed water, or sacred texts? Bertha's case seemed to meet many of these criteria. When Father Wilhelm held up a crucifix, she recoiled as if burned. When he sprinkled holy water in her direction, she screamed about fire coursing through her veins. But perhaps most convincingly, she began to speak in fluent Latin, reciting passages from theological texts that even educated monks found challenging. For a peasant woman who had never left her village, such knowledge seemed impossible, unless something else was speaking through her. What Father Wilhelm didn't know was that Bertha had been suffering from what modern medicine might diagnose as a severe psychological episode, possibly triggered by trauma or a neurological condition. But in the 13th century, medical understanding of mental illness was primitive at best. The four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were thought to govern human behaviour. But when their imbalance produced truly bizarre symptoms, supernatural explanations often seemed more plausible than natural ones. The medieval distinction between possession and obsession was crucial here. Possession implied that a demon had taken complete control of a person's body and soul, speaking through them and directing their actions. Obsession, however, suggested that the demon remained external, tormenting and harassing the victim without fully inhabiting them. This distinction would prove important not just for treatment, but for how society viewed and treated the afflicted. Father Wilhelm, following centuries of church tradition, decided that Bertha was indeed possessed and that exorcism was necessary. But medieval exorcism wasn't the dramatic, isolated ritual that modern movies might suggest. It was often a prolonged process involving multiple priests, detailed preparation, and community involvement that could last for weeks or even months. The preparation for Bertha's exorcism began with Father Wilhelm consulting his bishop and gathering a small team of experienced clergy. The church had learned, through bitter experience, that exorcism was dangerous work, not just for the possessed, but for those attempting to drive out the demon. There were accounts of exorcists being attacked, thrown against walls, or even dying during the ritual. Some priests had emerged from successful exorcisms bearing physical wounds that seemed to have no earthly explanation. Medieval exorcism followed specific protocols that had been developed and refined over centuries. The ritual typically began with the exorcist and assistants fasting and praying for several days, purifying themselves for the spiritual battle ahead. The location, usually a church or chapel, would be consecrated with holy water and blessed salt. Even these basic elements required their own exorcism, as medieval belief held that demons could contaminate anything, even the tools meant to drive them out. In a 12th century manuscript now preserved in the British Library, we find a detailed account of how salt and water were exorcised before use in baptism or demon expulsion. The priest would hold the salt and recite "Exorcizo te, creatura salis, per Deum vivum, per Deum verum, per Deum sanctum. I exorcise thee, creature of salt, by the living God, by the true God, by the holy God." The sign of the cross would be made repeatedly throughout the incantation, creating a protective barrier between the sacred elements and any lurking evil forces. As Father Wilhelm prepared for Bertha's exorcism, he followed these ancient protocols with meticulous care. The salt and water were blessed, in the prescribed manner. Holy relics were arranged around the space, and specific prayers were recited to create what medieval theologians called a fortress of faith, a spiritual stronghold from which the battle against evil could be waged safely. But the most crucial element was the exorcist himself. Medieval church law required that only experienced priests with episcopal permission could perform major exorcisms. These men had to demonstrate not just theological knowledge, but extraordinary spiritual fortitude. They were the church's special forces, trained to confront evil directly and emerge victorious through faith, preparation, and divine assistance. On a cold November morning in 1267, Father Wilhelm and 2 assistant priests entered the small stone chapel where Bertha had been brought. Her family waited outside, kneeling in prayer while their daughter's screams echoed through the thin walls. Inside, the scene was both terrifying and heartbreaking. A young woman who had once embroidered altar cloths was now bound to prevent her from harming herself or others, her voice alternating between pitiful pleas for help and guttural threats spoken in languages that seemed older than memory. The medieval exorcism ritual began with the Litany of Saints, a lengthy prayer calling upon every holy figure in the Christian pantheon for assistance. Mary, Michael the Archangel, and countless martyrs and confessors were invoked by name, creating a celestial army to stand against the forces of darkness. As Father Wilhelm recited each name, he made the sign of the cross over Bertha, watching carefully for any reaction. Medieval exorcists believed that demons were compelled to reveal their names when properly challenged. This wasn't mere curiosity. Knowing a demon's true name was thought to give the exorcist power over it. Throughout history, demonologists had catalogued thousands of demonic names, from Azazel and Mephistopheles to more obscure entities that plagued specific regions or communities. Each name carried its own significance, its own weaknesses, and its own methods of banishment. When Father Wilhelm demanded that the demon identify itself, Bertha's response was swift and violent. Her voice dropped to an inhuman growl as she spat out a name that made the young assistant priests step backward in fear. She claimed to be possessed by Belphegor, a high-ranking demon associated with sloth and discord. Whether this was theatrics, delusion, or something more supernatural, the effect on those present was unmistakable. The very air seemed to grow heavier, and shadows appeared to flicker despite the steady candlelight. Medieval demonology held that different demons required different approaches for expulsion. Some responded to direct confrontation and commands, others to lengthy negotiations and spiritual bargaining. Belphegor, according to the texts Father Wilhelm had studied, was particularly cunning, a demon that worked through temptation and gradual corruption rather than obvious possession. If Bertha was indeed afflicted by such an entity, the exorcism would require patience and psychological sophistication that pushed medieval understanding to its limits. The process continued for hours. Father Wilhelm recited passages from the Gospels, particularly those accounts where Christ himself had cast out demons. He sprinkled holy water, held up sacred relics, and called upon divine authority to compel the demon's departure. Between these ritual actions, he spoke directly to Bertha. Not the demon, but the human soul he believed was trapped beneath the supernatural influence. Bertha, daughter of God, you are beloved of the Almighty, he would say during the calmer moments. Remember your baptism. Remember your first communion. Remember that you belong to Christ and no force of darkness can claim you permanently. These words of comfort and spiritual reinforcement were as important as the more dramatic, confrontational elements, representing the medieval church's understanding that the human spirit needed strengthening as much as the demon needed banishing. Medieval exorcism wasn't just about driving out evil, it was about healing and restoration. The goal wasn't simply to end the possession, but to return the afflicted person to full spiritual and physical health. This holistic approach meant that exorcisms often included elements we might recognize as early forms of psychotherapy. Talking through traumas, reinforcing positive identity, and providing emotional support during what was obviously a time of severe distress. As night fell on the first day of Bertha's exorcism, Father Wilhelm called for a recess. Medieval practice held that particularly difficult cases might require multiple sessions spread over days or weeks. The demon needed to be worn down gradually, its hold on the victim weakened through persistent spiritual assault. But the exorcist and his assistants also needed rest. The psychological and spiritual toll of confronting pure evil was enormous, and exhausted priests made mistakes that could prove fatal. During the night, while Bertha rested under guard, Father Wilhelm consulted his collection of theological texts. Medieval priests had access to centuries of accumulated knowledge about demonic possession and exorcism. St. Augustine had written extensively about the nature of evil. St. Jerome had translated biblical accounts of possession into Latin, and countless medieval theologians had added their own insights based on practical experience. One text that particularly guided Father Wilhelm was written by an Augustinian canon named Albert from Bavaria, completed in the 1370s. This manual for German parish priests was remarkably progressive for its time, distinguishing between different types of spiritual affliction and advocating for compassionate treatment of those suffering from what he called demonic obsession. External torment that didn't involve full possession. Albert's work suggested that some apparent possessions might be medical or psychological in nature, requiring care rather than confrontation. This more nuanced understanding was beginning to emerge across medieval Europe by the 14th century, while earlier periods had seen mental illness and unusual behavior as clear signs of demonic influence. Later, medieval thinkers began to explore medical explanations based on humoral theory. The balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile in the human body was thought to affect not just physical health, but mental state and behavior. An excess of black bile, for instance, could produce melancholy, depression, and erratic actions that might be mistaken for possession. Father Wilhelm faced a dilemma that confronted many medieval exorcists: how to distinguish between supernatural, possession, and natural illness. The Church had developed criteria for making this determination, but they weren't always clear-cut. True possession was supposed to involve supernatural knowledge, speaking in unknown languages and physical phenomena that defied natural explanation. But what if a disturbed person had overheard Latin prayers and repeated them? What if their apparent supernatural strength came from the adrenaline of severe psychological distress? Some medieval authorities, particularly in university towns with emerging medical schools, began to advocate for medical examination before attempting exorcism. The University of Bologna, with its renowned medical faculty, produced several treatises arguing that physicians should evaluate apparent possessions to rule out physical causes. This represented a significant shift in medieval thinking, the beginning of what would eventually become modern psychiatry. But in a small Bavarian village in 1267, such sophisticated analysis wasn't available. Father Wilhelm had to rely on his training, his experience, and his faith. As he prepared for the second day of Bertha's exorcism, he made a decision that would prove crucial. He would proceed with the ritual, but he would also treat Bertha with the compassion and care appropriate for someone who might be suffering from an illness rather than demonic possession. This dual approach reflected an important development in medieval church practice. By the late 13th century, many clerics understood that regardless of the ultimate cause of someone's affliction, they were dealing with a human being in tremendous pain. Whether that pain came from demons, disease, or disturbance of the humors, it deserved respectful treatment. The exorcism ritual could proceed as a form of spiritual healing, even if the underlying problem wasn't supernatural. When the morning sun filtered through the chapel's narrow windows, Bertha appeared calmer, but utterly exhausted. The previous day's ordeal had drained her physically and emotionally, and Father Wilhelm could see the toll it had taken. Her family gathered outside the chapel again, their faces drawn with worry and sleepless nights. The entire community had been affected by this crisis. Medieval villages were small, close-knit places where one person's suffering touched everyone. The second day of exorcism began more gently. Instead of immediately confronting the supposed demon, Father Wilhelm started with prayers for healing and comfort. He recited Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," and other passages emphasizing God's protection and care. This wasn't weakness or compromise. It was sophisticated pastoral care that recognized the human dimension of whatever was happening to Bertha. Medieval exorcism manuals contained numerous accounts of possessions that resolved not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient, spiritual care. Sometimes the mere presence of holy objects and faithful prayers was enough to restore peace to a troubled soul. In other cases, the afflicted person simply needed time, rest, and the assurance that their community hadn't abandoned them in their darkest hour. As Father Wilhelm continued his gentle approach, something remarkable began to happen. Bertha's violent thrashing subsided, her screaming stopped, and she began to respond to her own name. The wild look in her eyes gradually cleared, replaced by confusion and exhaustion, but also recognition. She looked at Father Wilhelm and whispered, "Father, what happened to me?" This was the moment medieval exorcists prized above all others, the return of the person they were trying to save. Whether the change came from successful demon expulsion, medical recovery, or simply the healing power of compassionate care, the result was the same, a human being restored to herself and her community. Father Wilhelm offered a prayer of thanksgiving and carefully began the process of helping Bertha understand what she had experienced. Medieval aftercare for exorcism patients was as important as the ritual itself. The Church understood that people who had undergone such ordeals needed time to recover physically and emotionally. They also needed protection from community suspicion. Even after successful exorcism, some people worried that the person might be repossessed, or that they harbored some lingering connection to evil forces. Father Wilhelm spent several hours with Bertha, helping her piece together her memories and offering spiritual counseling. He explained that she had been ill. He deliberately chose that word rather than possessed, and that God had helped her recover. He assured her that she was completely healed and that there was no shame in what had happened. Most importantly, he emphasized that she was still a beloved member of their community with an important role to play in village life. This compassionate approach reflected the best of medieval pastoral care. While popular culture often portrays medieval attitudes toward mental illness as harsh and superstitious, the reality was more complex. Yes, there were cases of cruel treatment and misguided fear, but there were also countless examples of communities rallying around their afflicted members with remarkable kindness and support. Bertha's recovery became a source of inspiration, rather than suspicion in her village. Her family organized a Thanksgiving celebration. The community contributed to the church in gratitude for Father Wilhelm's work, and Bertha herself became known for her particular devotion to helping others in distress. Whether her original affliction had been supernatural, medical, or psychological, the outcome was healing and restoration, exactly what medieval exorcism was supposed to achieve. But not every case ended so positively. Medieval records contain numerous accounts of exorcisms that failed, possessions that resisted all attempts at healing, and tragic outcomes that haunt the historical record. These failures taught medieval practitioners important lessons about the limits of their knowledge and the dangers of overconfidence when confronting forces they didn't fully understand. In 14th century France, a monastery recorded the case of Brother Thomas, a young monk who began exhibiting signs of possession after discovering ancient texts in the abbey library. Unlike Bertha's case, Thomas's affliction seemed to worsen rather than improve with exorcism attempts. He spoke in multiple languages, demonstrated uncanny knowledge of distant events, and caused physical phenomena that multiple witnesses swore were impossible to fake. Brother Thomas's case terrified his monastic community because it suggested that even dedicated religious could fall victim to demonic influence. The monastery's abbot consulted with bishops, theological experts, and experienced exorcists, but none could explain why their efforts were ineffective. Some suggested that Thomas had willingly opened himself to demonic influence through pride in his learning, a common medieval belief that intellectual arrogance could provide an entry point for evil forces. The theological implications were troubling. If a monk living under strict religious discipline could be possessed despite his prayers, fasting, and spiritual dedication, what hope did ordinary people have? This case and others like it forced medieval thinkers to develop more sophisticated theories about how and why possession occurred. They began to understand that spiritual warfare was more complex than simple battles between good and evil. Sometimes, the enemy worked through subtlety, temptation, and the exploitation of human weaknesses. Medieval demonology catalogued various ways that demons could gain influence over humans. Pride was considered the most dangerous vulnerability. The same sin that had caused Lucifer's fall from heaven could open contemporary souls to corruption. Despair was another entry point, as was excessive fear, anger, or any extreme emotion that disrupted the spiritual balance necessary for protection against evil. Even positive traits like curiosity or devotion could become dangerous if they led people into forbidden knowledge or spiritual practices outside church authority. Brother Thomas's case also highlighted the importance of scholarly caution when dealing with ancient texts. Medieval libraries contained works from various traditions: Greek philosophy, Jewish mysticism, early Christian heresies, and occasionally texts dealing with magic or demonology. While most of these were preserved for scholarly study rather than practical use, the Church was acutely aware that knowledge could be dangerous in the wrong hands or approached with the wrong intentions. The monastery's collection included several treatises on demonology that had been written by earlier Christian scholars attempting to understand and combat evil forces. These works contained detailed descriptions of demonic hierarchies, the names and attributes of specific demons, and sometimes the very incantations that were supposed to summon or control them. While the intention was always to understand the enemy in order to defeat it, medieval authorities worried that such knowledge could corrupt even well-intentioned readers. Brother Thomas had apparently been studying a collection of texts that included portions of ancient grimoires, magical textbooks that claimed to provide methods for summoning and controlling demons. The monastery's librarian had preserved these works as examples of dangerous heresy, but Thomas seemed to have approached them with academic curiosity rather than proper spiritual caution. According to his fellow monks, he had become obsessed with understanding how demons operated, gradually losing sight of the protective framework of Orthodox Christian theology. Medieval scholars walked a fine line between knowledge and danger. When studying demonology, the Church needed experts who could recognize and combat demonic influence, but creating such experts required exposing them to information that could corrupt them. This dilemma led to the development of strict protocols for those authorized to study such subjects, extensive spiritual preparation, episcopal oversight, and careful limitations on what texts could be accessed by whom. The University of Paris, medieval Europe's premier theological center, developed perhaps the most sophisticated approach to this problem. Students and scholars interested in demonology were required to demonstrate exceptional spiritual maturity and to work under the direct supervision of established masters. They studied demons not out of curiosity or desire for power, but as soldiers studying enemy tactics, always with the goal of strengthening Christian defenses against evil. But even with such precautions, the study of demonology claimed victims. Medieval records contain accounts of scholars who became obsessed with their research, priests who fell into despair after confronting too much evil, and monks who lost their faith after witnessing supernatural phenomena that challenged their understanding of divine order. The pursuit of knowledge about demons was like handling fire, potentially useful, but inherently dangerous. Brother Thomas's case ended tragically. After months of failed exorcism attempts, he died during what witnesses described as a final, violent confrontation with the forces possessing him. The monastery's records describe his death as both martyrdom and cautionary tale. He had died fighting against evil, but he had also died because he had ventured too far into dangerous territory without adequate spiritual protection. His death prompted the monastery to reconsider its library policies and led to broader church discussions about the proper limits of demonological study. Some authorities argued for destroying dangerous texts entirely, while others maintained that such knowledge was necessary for combating evil. The compromise that eventually emerged was stricter control over access combined with better training for those authorized to study such materials. The tragedy of Brother Thomas also highlighted an important aspect of medieval demonology: the belief that demons were not just random forces of chaos, but intelligent entities with specific goals and strategies. Medieval theologians developed elaborate theories about demonic hierarchies, with different levels of demons specializing in different types of corruption. Understanding these hierarchies was thought to be crucial for effective resistance and exorcism. At the top of the demonic hierarchy stood Lucifer, Satan, or the devil, different names for the same ultimate adversary of God and humanity. Below him were ranked various princes and generals of hell, each commanding legions of lesser demons and each specializing in particular forms of temptation or destruction. Some demons worked through pride and ambition, others through lust and gluttony, still others through despair and a spiritual doubt. Medieval demonologists believed that knowing which type of demon was involved in a possession was crucial for choosing the right exorcism strategy. A demon of pride might respond to humility and submission, while a demon of despair might require prayers of hope and resurrection. This sophisticated understanding reflected centuries of accumulated experience in spiritual warfare, passed down through generations of exorcists and preserved in church archives. But the hierarchical view of demons also created its own problems. If demons were organized military forces rather than random supernatural pests, it suggested that they had plans, strategies, and long-term goals for corrupting humanity. This paranoid worldview could lead to seeing demonic influence everywhere. In political conflicts, natural disasters, social changes, and personal failures, medieval Europe periodically erupted in demon-hunting frenzies that caused far more harm than any supernatural forces. The most extreme example of this occurred in the later medieval period with the emergence of witch hunting. While belief in Witchcraft had existed for centuries. It was the systematic demonological theory that transformed scattered folk beliefs into a coherent ideology of supernatural conspiracy. If demons had hierarchical organization and strategic goals, then surely they would recruit human allies to work toward those goals. The logic seemed unassailable, even though its application proved catastrophic. Medieval witch-hunting manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, applied demonological theory to create detailed procedures for identifying, interrogating, and executing supposed demon worshippers. These texts represented the dark side of medieval demonology, scholarly analysis twisted into persecution and murder. The same intellectual tradition that had produced compassionate approaches to mental illness and spiritual healing also produced some of history's most systematic cruelty. But it's important to understand that not all medieval authorities supported witch hunting. Many bishops, scholars, and exorcists maintained that true demonic possession was relatively rare, and that most supposed cases had natural explanations. They argued that hysteria, medical conditions, fraud, and social pressure could account for the vast majority of apparently supernatural phenomena. These voices of reason were often drowned out by popular fear and political opportunism, but they represent an important strand of medieval thought that deserves recognition. The distinction between demonic possession and demonic obsession, which we encountered earlier in the stories of Bertha and Brother Thomas, became crucial in these debates. Possession implied that a demon had taken complete control of a person's body and soul, making them temporarily inhuman and not responsible for their actions. Obsession, however, suggested external harassment that left the person's essential humanity intact, meaning they retained moral responsibility and deserved compassionate treatment rather than exorcism. This theological distinction had profound practical implications. Someone diagnosed with demonic possession might be subjected to violent exorcism rituals, restraint, and social ostracism. Someone diagnosed with demonic obsession might receive prayers, medical care, and community support. The difference in diagnosis could literally mean the difference between life and death, which is why medieval authorities eventually developed detailed criteria for making such determinations. The most progressive medieval thinkers went even further, suggesting that many supposed cases of demonic influence were actually medical or psychological conditions that should be treated by physicians rather than exorcists. This represented a revolutionary shift in medieval thinking, the beginning of what would eventually become modern psychiatry and psychotherapy. While it would take centuries for such ideas to become mainstream, their seeds were planted in medieval monasteries and universities where scholar priests grappled with the complex relationship between spiritual and physical health. One such progressive thinker was Bartholomeus Anglicus, a 13th century Franciscan friar whose encyclopedia on the properties of things included detailed discussions of mental illness and its relationship to supposed demonic possession. Bartholomeus argued that many symptoms attributed to demons could be explained by imbalances in the bodily humors, particularly an excess of melancholic humor that produced depression, delusions, and erratic behavior. His work was revolutionary because it suggested that apparent possessions might be treated through medical intervention rather than spiritual warfare. Diet, herbal medicines, bloodletting, and environmental changes could potentially restore humoral balance and eliminate symptoms that others attributed to supernatural causes. This medical approach didn't deny the existence of demons, but it placed them in a more limited role, real, but not responsible for every unexplained phenomenon. Similar ideas were emerging in medieval universities across Europe. The medical school at Salerno, building on ancient Greek and Islamic sources, developed sophisticated theories about mental illness that rarely involved supernatural explanations. Students learned to diagnose and treat conditions that modern medicine would recognize as depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. While their methods were primitive by current standards, their basic approach, looking for natural causes and treatments, represented a major advance in human understanding. The tension between medical and supernatural explanations for strange behavior created fascinating debates in medieval intellectual circles. At the University of Bologna, where both canon law and medicine were taught, scholars argued about whether particular cases should be handled by exorcists or physicians. Some cases seemed clearly medical. Fever-induced delirium, for instance, was well understood and easily treated. Others appeared genuinely supernatural, involving phenomena that no known medical theory could explain. But many cases fell into a grey area where both explanations seemed plausible. A person speaking in unknown languages might be possessed by a demon, or they might have been exposed to foreign languages in childhood and be remembering them during psychological stress. Someone displaying supernatural strength might be demonically empowered, or they might be experiencing the enhanced physical capabilities that extreme mental states can sometimes produce. Medieval authorities developed various tests to distinguish between natural and supernatural phenomena. True possession was supposed to involve knowledge that the person could not have acquired naturally, details about distant events, ability to read Latin without education, or familiarity with theological concepts beyond their background. But even these tests were problematic, since memory and knowledge could be more complex than they appeared. The most reliable indicator of genuine possession, according to medieval experts, was the reaction to holy objects and sacred rituals. Someone suffering from a medical condition might rave, thrash, and speak incoherently, but they wouldn't necessarily recoil from crucifixes or scream during prayers. This test seemed to provide a clear distinction between natural and supernatural afflictions, until scholars began to notice that suggestion and expectation could produce similar reactions in people who weren't possessed, but believed they were. This observation led to some of the most sophisticated psychological analysis in medieval literature. Scholars began to understand that the human mind could play tricks on itself, creating symptoms that seemed supernatural but were actually produced by fear, expectation, and social pressure. A person who believed they were possessed might unconsciously mimic the symptoms they expected to experience, creating a convincing performance that fooled even experienced exorcists. These insights didn't eliminate belief in demonic possession, but they did encourage more careful evaluation of suspected cases. Medieval authorities developed detailed questionnaires and observation protocols designed to distinguish between genuine supernatural phenomena and psychological mimicry. They also began to recommend medical evaluation as a routine part of any exorcism investigation, not because they doubted the existence of demons, but because they wanted to be sure they were dealing with the right type of problem. The practical result was a more humane and effective approach to people suffering from mental distress. Whether someone was possessed, obsessed, or simply ill, they were more likely to receive appropriate care and less likely to be subjected to harsh treatment based on superstitious fear. This represented a significant advance in medieval medicine and pastoral care, even though it would take centuries for these insights to become widespread. But perhaps the most important development in medieval demonology was the growing understanding that spiritual and physical healing often worked together. Even if someone was genuinely possessed, they still needed medical care for the physical toll that possession took on their body. Even if someone's symptoms were purely medical, they might still benefit from spiritual support and prayer. The best medieval practitioners learned to address both dimensions simultaneously, creating integrated approaches that anticipated modern holistic medicine. This integration was particularly evident in monastic medicine, where monk physicians combined medical knowledge with spiritual wisdom in their treatment of both physical and mental ailments. Monasteries often served as medieval hospitals, caring for pilgrims, travelers, and local residents who couldn't afford private physicians. The monks who ran these institutions understood that healing involved more than just treating symptoms. It required addressing the whole person, including their spiritual and emotional needs. The monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy became particularly famous for its integrated approach to treating mental distress. The monks there developed protocols that began with medical evaluation and treatment, continued with spiritual counseling and prayer, and concluded with gradual reintegration into community life. They understood that someone who had experienced severe mental illness needed not just healing, but restoration of their sense of identity and belonging. Similar approaches emerged at other monastic centers across Europe. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland maintained detailed medical records that show how they distinguished between different types of mental distress and tailored their treatments accordingly. Some patients received primarily medical care, herbal medicines, dietary changes, and rest. Others underwent primarily spiritual treatment, prayer, confession, and religious counseling. Most received a combination of both, with the proportions adjusted based on careful observation of their symptoms and response to treatment. These monastic hospitals also provided something that was often missing from other medieval institutions: long-term care for people with chronic mental illness. Someone who couldn't be completely cured might still live a meaningful life within the monastery community, contributing what they could while receiving ongoing support and care. This represented a remarkably progressive approach that wouldn't be matched by secular institutions for centuries to come. The success of monastic medicine in treating mental distress also influenced secular approaches to the problem. Urban authorities began to establish hospitals modeled on monastic institutions, and wealthy families started to seek out monk physicians for relatives suffering from mental illness. The reputation of monastic medicine was so strong that even non-Christians sometimes sought treatment at Christian monasteries when other options had been exhausted. But monastic medicine couldn't solve every problem, and medieval records contain numerous accounts of cases that resisted all attempts at healing. These failures were as instructive as the successes, teaching medieval practitioners about the limits of their knowledge and the need for humility when confronting forces they didn't fully understand. Whether those forces were supernatural, medical, or psychological, they reminded healers that human understanding was finite and that some mysteries might never be fully solved. The story of Sister Marguerite at the convent of Sainte-Croix illustrates both the potential and the limits of medieval approaches to mental distress. Marguerite had entered the convent as a young woman with a reputation for unusual spiritual experiences, visions, ecstasies, and apparent communications with divine beings. Initially, these were welcomed as signs of special holiness, and Marguerite became known throughout the region as a mystic and visionary. But gradually, Marguerite's experiences became more disturbing. She claimed to receive messages not just from saints and angels, but from darker sources that commanded her to perform acts of self-mortification and to denounce her fellow nuns as sinners. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, alternating between periods of apparent sanctity and episodes of violence and despair. The convent's abbess, initially supportive, began to worry that something was seriously wrong. The community faced a dilemma that confronted many medieval religious institutions. Were Marguerite's experiences genuine communications from the spiritual realm, or were they symptoms of mental illness? How could they distinguish between true mystical experiences and dangerous delusions? The stakes were high. If Marguerite was genuinely receiving divine revelations, opposing her would be sinful. But if she was suffering from mental illness or demonic influence, allowing her to continue unchecked could endanger the entire community. The abbess consulted with neighboring monasteries, diocesan authorities, and medical experts before developing a careful plan for evaluating Marguerite's condition. They would observe her closely, document her experiences, and test whether her apparent revelations contained knowledge she could not have acquired naturally. Most importantly, they would provide both medical and spiritual care while conducting this evaluation, ensuring that Marguerite received help regardless of the ultimate diagnosis. The investigation lasted several months and revealed a complex picture that defied simple categorization. Some of Marguerite's experiences seemed genuinely mystical. She accurately predicted events that later came to pass and demonstrated knowledge of theological concepts that exceeded her education. But other aspects of her condition suggested mental illness. She suffered from severe mood swings, engaged in dangerous self-harm, and sometimes lost awareness of her surroundings for hours at a time. The medical evaluation revealed signs of what modern medicine might recognize as bipolar disorder or possibly temporal lobe epilepsy. Marguerite's family history included relatives who had suffered from similar symptoms, suggesting a hereditary component that medieval physicians were beginning to understand. Her diet was poor, her sleep irregular, and her overall physical health had deteriorated significantly since her mystical experiences began. But the spiritual evaluation was equally revealing. Marguerite's genuine piety and devotion were unmistakable, and some of her mystical experiences seemed to produce lasting positive changes in her character and behavior. She showed remarkable insight into scripture and theology during her lucid periods, and her prayers and counseling helped other nuns through their own spiritual difficulties. The team evaluating Marguerite's case reached a conclusion that reflected the growing sophistication of medieval thinking about mental health and spirituality. They determined that she was suffering from a medical condition that made her particularly susceptible to intense spiritual experiences, some genuine, others probably delusional. Rather than choosing between purely medical or purely spiritual explanations, they developed an integrated treatment plan that addressed both dimensions of her condition. Marguerite's treatment included herbal medicines to stabilize her mood, dietary changes to improve her physical health, and a carefully structured daily routine that provided stability and support. But it also included continued spiritual direction, regular prayer and meditation, and opportunities to share her genuine insights with the community. The goal was not to suppress her mystical experiences entirely, but to help her distinguish between authentic spiritual communications and symptoms of her illness. The success of this integrated approach was remarkable. Within a year, Marguerite's violent episodes had largely ceased, her self-destructive behavior had stopped, and her mystical experiences had become less frequent but more coherent. She remained in the convent for the rest of her life, serving as both a recipient of care and a provider of spiritual guidance to others. Her case became a model for other religious communities dealing with similar situations. Marguerite's story illustrates how medieval practitioners gradually learned to navigate the complex relationship between spirituality and mental health. They didn't abandon belief in genuine mystical experiences, but they became more sophisticated about distinguishing between different types of unusual phenomena. They also developed treatment approaches that could address multiple possible causes simultaneously, providing comprehensive care that modern medicine would recognize as remarkably advanced for its time. The broader implications of cases like Marguerite's extended far beyond individual treatment. They forced medieval thinkers to reconsider fundamental questions about the nature of spiritual experience, the relationship between soul and body, and the proper role of religious authorities in caring for those who suffered from mental distress. These discussions took place in universities, monasteries, and episcopal courts across Europe, gradually building a more nuanced understanding of human psychology and its relationship to religious belief. The University of Montpellier, with its famous medical school, became a center for these discussions. Scholars there developed theories about how physical ailments could influence spiritual experience and how spiritual practices could affect physical health. They studied cases of apparent possession and mystical experience with the same careful attention they gave to other medical conditions, documenting symptoms, treatments, and outcomes with unprecedented precision. Their work began to reveal patterns that would be familiar to modern researchers. Certain types of brain injury or illness seem to predispose people to religious visions and auditory hallucinations. Fasting, sleep deprivation, and other ascetic practices could trigger intense spiritual experiences that might be mistaken for supernatural communications. Even more intriguingly, some people seemed to have natural tendencies toward mystical experience that could be either encouraged or suppressed, depending on their environment and treatment. These insights led to important practical developments in medieval spiritual direction. Experienced religious advisors learned to distinguish between different types of mystical experience and to guide their charges toward authentic spiritual growth while protecting them from the dangers of delusion or mental illness. They developed sophisticated techniques for evaluating claims of divine revelation, testing them against scripture, tradition, and common sense. The criteria that emerged from this process were remarkably similar to those used by modern psychiatrists and psychologists when evaluating unusual experiences. Did the person retain insight into their condition? Could they distinguish between their experiences and reality? Did their experiences lead to positive or negative changes in their behavior and relationships? Were they able to function effectively in daily life despite their unusual experiences? These questions helped medieval spiritual directors provide better guidance to those under their care while protecting religious communities from the disruption that could result from untreated mental illness. They also helped to reduce the stigma associated with mental distress by providing alternative explanations that didn't involve moral failure or spiritual corruption. But perhaps most importantly, the medieval development of sophisticated approaches to mental health and spiritual experience established principles that would influence Western thinking for centuries to come. The idea that unusual experiences might have multiple possible explanations, that treatment should address both physical and psychological dimensions of illness, and that people suffering from mental distress deserved compassionate care rather than punishment or abandonment. These insights emerged from medieval monasteries and universities long before they became mainstream in secular medicine. The legacy of medieval demonology and exorcism is thus far more complex than popular culture suggests. Yes, there were cases of superstition, cruelty, and persecution, but there were also remarkable examples of compassion, sophistication, and genuine healing. Medieval practitioners developed treatment approaches that anticipated modern psychotherapy and holistic medicine while maintaining a framework of meaning and hope that helped people through their darkest hours. The careful documentation that medieval monasteries and universities maintained about their work with mental illness and spiritual distress provides modern researchers with invaluable insights into the history of psychiatry and psychology. These records show that the understanding of mental health developed gradually over centuries, with each generation building on the insights of their predecessors and learning from both successes and failures. One particularly revealing collection of documents comes from the Abbey of St. Denis near Paris, where monks maintain detailed case records of everyone who came to them seeking help for mental or spiritual distress. These records, spanning nearly 3 centuries, show the evolution of medieval thinking about such conditions and demonstrate the growing sophistication of treatment approaches over time. The earliest records from St. Denis reflect relatively simple approaches to mental distress, prayer, fasting, and sometimes exorcism for cases that seemed supernatural. But later documents show increasing attention to medical evaluation, family history, environmental factors, and long-term care planning. The monks gradually learned to ask different questions and to look for different types of solutions, developing more effective and humane approaches to helping those in need. The St. Denis records also reveal the important role that families and communities played in medieval mental health care. Unlike modern psychiatric institutions that often isolate patients from their normal social relationships, medieval monasteries typically worked closely with families to develop treatment plans that could be sustained after the person returned home. They understood that long-term recovery required not just individual healing, but restoration of social connections and community support. This community-based approach had significant advantages that modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover. People who maintained connections to family, friends, and community during their treatment were more likely to recover completely and less likely to experience relapses. They also retained their sense of identity and belonging, which provided crucial psychological resources for coping with ongoing challenges. The medieval emphasis on community support was particularly important for people whose mental distress had been attributed to demonic possession or influence. These individuals faced not only the challenge of recovery from their illness, but also the need to rebuild their reputation and social relationships. Medieval communities developed various rituals and practices to facilitate this reintegration, recognizing that social healing was as important as individual healing. The process typically began with careful preparation of the community before the person's return. Religious authorities would explain what had happened, emphasize that the person was completely healed, and remind community members of their Christian duty to show compassion and forgiveness. Special prayers might be offered for the person's continued health and for the community's ability to provide appropriate support. The actual return was often marked by some form of public ceremony that demonstrated the person's restoration to full community membership. This might include participation in religious services, public testimony about their recovery, or simply the resumption of normal social and economic activities. The goal was to make it clear that the person was no longer defined by their illness, and that they had an important role to play in community life. These reintegration practices reflected a sophisticated understanding of the social dimensions of mental health that modern medicine is only beginning to appreciate. Medieval practitioners understood that mental illness didn't just affect individuals. It affected entire networks of relationships and required community-wide healing efforts to be fully resolved. The success of medieval community-based approaches to mental health care influenced the development of similar practices in other areas of medical treatment. The idea that healing required not just individual intervention, but community support became a cornerstone of medieval medical philosophy, influencing everything from surgical recovery to epidemic management. This holistic approach to health and healing represented one of medieval civilization's most important contributions to human knowledge. By refusing to separate physical health from spiritual well-being, individual treatment from community support, or medical intervention from pastoral care, medieval practitioners developed integrated approaches that addressed the full complexity of human suffering and healing. The decline of these integrated approaches during the early modern period represented a significant loss that Western medicine is still working to recover from. The increasing specialization of medical practice, while advancing technical knowledge, often came at the cost of holistic understanding and comprehensive care. Only in recent decades have medical schools begun to rediscover the importance of addressing psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions of illness alongside purely physical symptoms. Medieval demonology and exorcism, when understood in their proper historical context, thus offer important lessons for contemporary practitioners working with mental health and spiritual distress. They remind us that effective healing requires attention to multiple dimensions of human experience, and that approaches which ignore the social and spiritual aspects of illness are likely to fall short of their goals. The medieval understanding that demons whether understood literally or metaphorically, represent forces that attack human wholeness, and community connection remains relevant for contemporary discussions of mental health and social pathology. Modern demons might take the form of addiction, trauma, social isolation, or economic desperation, but they require similar approaches: patient care, community support, and restoration of meaning and hope. The medieval insight that some forms of distress require spiritual as well as medical intervention has been validated by modern research into the relationship between religious belief, social support, and mental health outcomes. People who maintain strong spiritual practices and community connections typically show better recovery rates from mental illness and greater resilience in facing life's challenges. The medieval emphasis on careful evaluation and differential diagnosis before attempting treatment has also proven its worth in contemporary practice. Just as medieval exorcists learned to distinguish between possession, obsession, and medical illness, modern practitioners must learn to distinguish between different types of psychological distress and to tailor their interventions accordingly. Perhaps, most importantly, the medieval commitment to treating all people, regardless of their condition or its supposed cause, with dignity and compassion remains a crucial foundation for ethical medical practice. The best medieval practitioners understood that their primary obligation was to relieve suffering and restore wholeness, not to judge or punish those who came to them seeking help. As our exploration of medieval demonology and exorcism draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on how these historical practices illuminate enduring questions about the nature of human experience and the proper response to suffering. Medieval practitioners grappled with many of the same challenges that confront contemporary healers: how to distinguish between different types of distress, how to provide effective treatment while maintaining hope and dignity, and how to support both individuals and communities through difficult times. Their solutions weren't always perfect, and they sometimes fell victim to the limitations of their time and culture. But at their best, medieval approaches to mental and spiritual distress embodied values and insights that remain relevant today. The importance of careful observation and evaluation, the need for both individual and community healing, the value of integrated approaches that address multiple dimensions of human experience, and above all, the fundamental obligation to treat every person with compassion and respect. The candlelit chambers where medieval exorcisms took place were thus not just sites of superstition and fear, but laboratories where dedicated practitioners worked to understand and alleviate human suffering. The Latin incantations that echoed through stone corridors were not just ancient formulas, but carefully developed therapeutic interventions based on centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience. The holy water that dripped from trembling fingers carried with it not just religious symbolism, but the hopes and prayers of communities committed to healing and restoration. And the people who emerged from these chambers, whether their distress had been supernatural, medical, or psychological in origin, carried with them not just individual recovery, but renewed connections to the communities that had supported them through their darkest hours. In our modern world, where mental illness is often stigmatized and spiritual distress frequently ignored, the medieval integration of medical care, pastoral counseling, and community support offers a vision of healing that addresses the full complexity of human experience. The demons that medieval practitioners confronted, whether literal or metaphorical, were forces that threatened human wholeness and community connection. Their methods for combating these forces emphasized patience, compassion, careful evaluation, and comprehensive care. These principles remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. The names we give to human distress may have changed, the specific techniques we use may have evolved, but the fundamental challenge remains the same: how to restore wholeness to broken lives and hope to desperate hearts. In meeting that challenge, we can still learn from the wisdom of medieval practitioners who understood that healing requires not just technical skill, but genuine care for the whole person and the whole community. As the last candle gutters out in our medieval chapel and silence settles over the ancient stones, we're left with a deeper appreciation for the complexity and sophistication of medieval approaches to human suffering. The exorcists and healers who worked in these chambers were not simply superstitious relics of a darker age, but dedicated practitioners grappling with perennial human challenges in ways that anticipated many modern insights. Their legacy reminds us that healing is always both an art and a science, requiring not just technical knowledge, but wisdom, compassion, and a deep understanding of the social and spiritual dimensions of human experience. In our own time, as we continue to grapple with questions of mental health, spiritual distress, and community healing, we would do well to remember the lessons learned in those candlelit chambers where faith and reason, tradition and innovation, individual care and community support came together in service of human wholeness and hope. The medieval world may seem distant and alien to us now, but the fundamental human experiences of suffering and healing, fear and hope, isolation and community remain unchanged. The demons that haunted medieval minds may have different names today, but they represent the same forces that threaten human flourishing in every age. And the commitment to face those forces with courage, compassion, and carefully developed skill remains as necessary now as it was when Latin prayers echoed through stone corridors and holy water was sprinkled with trembling but determined hands. In the end, the true power of medieval exorcism lay not in any supernatural efficacy, but in its embodiment of human virtues. The courage to confront difficult truths, the patience to persist through long struggles, the wisdom to seek multiple types of understanding, and above all, the compassion to treat every suffering person as deserving of care, respect, and hope for healing. These virtues remain as powerful today as they were in the medieval world, and they continue to offer the best foundation for human healing and community restoration. The silence that now fills our medieval chapel is not empty, but full of the echoes of prayers offered, tears shed, and healing accomplished. It reminds us that in every age, in every place, there are those who dedicate themselves to the relief of human suffering and the restoration of human wholeness. Their methods may change, their understanding may evolve, but their fundamental commitment remains constant: to stand with those who suffer, to offer hope to those who despair, and to work tirelessly for the healing of both individuals and communities. And perhaps that is the most important lesson we can take from our exploration of medieval demonology and exorcism: that healing is always ultimately about human connection, community support, and the shared commitment to face whatever forces threaten human flourishing with courage, wisdom, and above all, with love. The medieval world's approach to demons and exorcism reveals something profound about human nature itself: our eternal struggle to understand suffering, to provide comfort to those in distress, and to maintain hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. In the flickering candlelight of those ancient chambers, we see reflections of our own desperate desire to heal, to help, and to hold fast to the belief that no darkness is so complete that it cannot be overcome by persistent compassion and careful attention to human need. The Latin words that once echoed through monastery halls, exorcizo te, creatura salis, were more than just ritual formulas. They were expressions of humanity's refusal to accept that suffering was inevitable, or that those who experienced mental distress were beyond help. Each syllable carried with it centuries of accumulated wisdom about the delicate relationship between body and soul, individual and community, knowledge and faith. The salt and water that medieval priests blessed with such care represented something far more significant than mere religious symbolism. They embodied the human understanding that healing often begins with the simplest elements: basic care, clean water, nourishment, and the patient application of whatever knowledge and skill are available. The elaborate rituals that surrounded their blessing reflected not superstition, but a sophisticated understanding that effective healing requires attention to both practical and psychological dimensions of human experience. Medieval practitioners, who gathered around the bedside of someone experiencing mental distress, brought with them not just theological training, but centuries of careful observation about what worked and what didn't in alleviating human suffering. Their approaches evolved, constantly adapting to new situations and incorporating insights from medicine, philosophy, and practical experience. The best among them understood that their primary obligation was not to uphold doctrine or demonstrate power, but to reduce suffering and restore wholeness wherever possible. The communities that supported these healing efforts demonstrated values that remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. They understood that mental illness affected not just individuals, but entire networks of relationships, and that effective treatment required community-wide commitment to the process of healing and restoration. The rituals they developed for reintegrating recovered individuals into normal social life reflected sophisticated insights into the social dimensions of mental health that modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval approaches to demonic possession and mental illness anticipated many of the key principles that guide contemporary mental health practice. The emphasis on careful evaluation before treatment, the recognition that different types of distress require different interventions, the importance of treating underlying physical conditions alongside psychological symptoms, and the need for long-term support and community involvement, all of these insights emerged from medieval monasteries and universities long before they became mainstream in secular medicine. The theological framework that medieval practitioners used to understand demonic possession provided them with a vocabulary for discussing experiences that would otherwise have been impossible to address. When someone claimed to hear voices or to be controlled by external forces, the medieval concept of demonic influence offered a way to take these experiences seriously while still maintaining hope for recovery. This was far more sophisticated than simply dismissing such reports as imagination or fraud. The medieval understanding that demons were intelligent entities with specific goals and strategies led to treatment approaches that addressed the psychological and social factors that might make someone vulnerable to mental distress. If pride, despair, or social isolation could provide entry points for demonic influence, then treatment needed to address these underlying vulnerabilities as well as the immediate symptoms. This holistic approach recognized that effective healing required attention to the whole person and their entire social environment. The monastic hospitals that emerged throughout medieval Europe represented one of humanity's earliest attempts to provide systematic, compassionate care for people experiencing mental illness. These institutions combined medical knowledge with spiritual wisdom, individual treatment with community support, and immediate intervention with long-term care planning. The monks and nuns who staffed these hospitals understood that healing was a process that required patience, skill, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. The records they maintained provide modern researchers with invaluable insights into the gradual development of humane approaches to mental health care. Case after case documents the slow accumulation of knowledge about what works in treating different types of psychological distress, the refinement of diagnostic criteria, and the evolution of treatment protocols that balanced effectiveness with compassion. The failures documented in these records are as instructive as the successes. Medieval practitioners were honest about the limits of their knowledge and the cases that resisted all attempts at healing. These failures taught them humility and encouraged the continued search for better understanding and more effective interventions. They also reinforced the importance of providing comfort and support, even when cure was impossible. The theological debates that surrounded medieval demonology reflect the broader human struggle to understand the relationship between mind and body, individual responsibility and external influence, natural causation and supernatural intervention. These discussions took place in universities and monasteries across Europe, gradually building a more nuanced understanding of human psychology and its relationship to physical health. The integration of medical and spiritual approaches that characterized the best medieval practice offers important lessons for contemporary healthcare. Modern medicine's tendency to compartmentalize different aspects of human experience, physical, psychological, social, spiritual, often results in fragmented care that addresses symptoms without attending to underlying causes or broader contexts. Medieval practitioners, by refusing to separate these dimensions, often achieved more comprehensive healing than their modern counterparts. The medieval emphasis on community involvement in healing processes also offers valuable insights for contemporary practice. The recognition that mental illness affects entire social networks and that recovery requires community support has been validated by modern research. Yet many current treatment approaches continue to focus primarily on individual intervention, while neglecting social and environmental factors. The gradual evolution of medieval thinking about demonic possession and mental illness demonstrates the importance of maintaining openness to new ideas while preserving valuable insights from the past. Medieval practitioners didn't abandon their theological framework when they began to understand medical causes of mental distress. Instead, they integrated new knowledge into existing systems of meaning in ways that enhanced, rather than diminished, their ability to provide effective care. This adaptive approach offers important lessons for contemporary efforts to integrate scientific and humanistic approaches to mental health. Rather than viewing these as competing paradigms, medieval practitioners demonstrated that different types of understanding can work together to provide more comprehensive and effective care than either approach could achieve alone. The medieval understanding of exorcism as a healing practice rather than a punitive one reflects values that remain crucial for ethical medical practice. The goal was always to restore the person to health and wholeness, not to punish them for their condition, or to demonstrate the power of religious authority. This therapeutic orientation led to innovations in treatment that anticipated many modern developments in psychotherapy and rehabilitation. The transformation of medieval thinking about demonic possession over the centuries reveals a gradual sophistication that parallels the development of modern psychiatric understanding. Early medieval approaches were often crude and based on limited theological knowledge, but by the later medieval period, practitioners had developed nuanced theories about different types of spiritual affliction and corresponding treatment approaches that showed remarkable psychological insight. The emergence of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries provided new venues for scholarly discussion of demonology and mental illness. The University of Paris, with its famous theological faculty, became a center for debates about the nature of demonic influence and its relationship to natural causes of mental distress. Students and masters engaged in sophisticated arguments about how to distinguish between supernatural and medical explanations for unusual behavior. These academic discussions weren't merely theoretical exercises. They had immediate practical implications for how communities responded to people experiencing mental distress. The development of more careful diagnostic criteria meant that fewer people were subjected to harsh exorcism rituals when medical treatment might be more appropriate. The growing emphasis on differential diagnosis represented a major advance. In medieval medical practice, the influence of Islamic medical texts, translated into Latin during the medieval period, also contributed to more sophisticated understanding of mental illness. Islamic physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina had developed detailed theories about psychological disorders that provided alternative explanations for symptoms that might otherwise be attributed to demonic possession. These texts became widely available in European universities and significantly influenced medieval thinking about the relationship between mind and body. The Crusades, despite their destructive impact, also facilitated intellectual exchange that enriched European understanding of mental illness and its treatment. Returning crusaders brought back knowledge of Eastern medical practices, including approaches to psychological disorders that emphasized natural causation and therapeutic intervention rather than supernatural explanation. This cross-cultural exchange gradually broadened the range of treatment options available to medieval practitioners. The development of more sophisticated approaches to mental illness was also influenced by the growth of urban centers and the emergence of new social problems. Cities created environments where unusual behavior was more visible and where traditional community support systems were less effective. Urban authorities needed new approaches to managing mental illness that could function in complex social environments where extended family networks were less available. The rise of merchant classes and increased social mobility also changed medieval attitudes toward mental illness. Wealthy families who could afford private care began to seek out the most skilled practitioners available, creating markets for specialized services that encouraged innovation and improvement in treatment approaches. The development of private madhouses and specialized care facilities reflected these changing economic and social conditions. Medieval hospitals evolved significantly during this period, developing from simple charitable institutions into sophisticated medical centers that could provide comprehensive care for various types of illness, including mental disorders. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, established in the 7th century, gradually developed specialized wards and treatment protocols for different types of patients, including those experiencing mental distress. The training of hospital staff also became more systematic during the later medieval period. Monks and nuns who worked in medical facilities received instruction not just in basic care techniques, but in recognizing different types of illness and providing appropriate interventions. This professionalization of hospital care represented a major advance in medieval medicine that had particular benefits for people experiencing mental illness. The development of written case records in medieval hospitals provides modern researchers with detailed insights into how attitudes toward mental illness evolved over time. Early records often contain brief, vague descriptions of patients' conditions, but later documents show increasing attention to symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. This growing emphasis on systematic observation and documentation reflected the influence of university-trained physicians who brought scholarly approaches to practical medical care. Medieval pharmacy also played an important role in treating mental illness, as herbalists and apothecaries developed increasingly sophisticated preparations for various psychological disorders. Monastic gardens became centers for experimenting with different combinations of medicinal plants, and detailed recipes were developed for treating conditions that we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and psychosis. The regulation of medical practice became more systematic during the later medieval period, with authorities establishing licensing requirements and professional standards that protected patients from incompetent or fraudulent practitioners. These regulations extended to those who claimed to perform exorcisms, as church authorities became increasingly concerned about unauthorized individuals conducting dangerous rituals without proper training or supervision. The emergence of lay religious movements also influenced medieval approaches to mental illness and demonic possession. Groups like the Franciscans and Dominicans emphasized direct service to the poor and marginalized, including those experiencing mental distress. Their work in urban areas brought them into contact with new types of psychological problems and encouraged the development of innovative approaches to care and treatment. Medieval art and literature from this period reflect changing attitudes toward mental illness and demonic possession. Earlier works often portrayed possessed individuals as completely inhuman, but later medieval art shows increasing attention to the humanity of those experiencing psychological distress. This artistic evolution paralleled changes in medical and theological thinking about the nature of mental illness. The Black Death and other epidemic diseases of the later medieval period also influenced thinking about mental illness, as communities struggled to understand and respond to psychological trauma on an unprecedented scale. The mass psychological disturbances that followed major epidemics forced medieval practitioners to develop new theories about collective mental illness and social responses to widespread psychological distress. Medieval legal systems also evolved to address questions raised by mental illness and demonic possession. Courts developed procedures for determining whether someone accused of crimes was responsible for their actions or was acting under the influence of mental illness or demonic possession. These legal developments reflected growing sophistication in understanding the relationship between mental state and moral responsibility. The development of more nuanced legal approaches to mental illness had important implications for how communities treated people experiencing psychological distress. Instead of simply excluding or punishing those who behaved unusually, legal systems began to develop protective measures that recognized diminished capacity while still maintaining social order. Medieval guilds and professional associations also played a role in developing standards for treating mental illness. Physician guilds established training requirements and ethical guidelines that influenced how medical practitioners approached psychological disorders. These professional standards helped ensure that patients received competent care from qualified practitioners. The medieval period also saw the development of more sophisticated theories about the prevention of mental illness. Practitioners began to understand that certain environmental and social factors could predispose individuals to psychological distress, leading to recommendations about diet, exercise, social relationships, and spiritual practices that could help maintain mental health. The emphasis on prevention represented a major advance in medieval medical thinking, as it suggested that mental illness wasn't simply a matter of fate or divine punishment, but could be influenced by human action and social planning. This preventive approach anticipated many modern insights about the social determinants of mental health. Medieval monasteries became particularly important centers for developing preventive approaches to mental illness, as they provided controlled environments where the effects of different lifestyle factors could be systematically observed. The regular schedules, balanced diets, moderate exercise, and strong social support that characterized monastic life seemed to protect against many forms of psychological distress. The success of monastic approaches to maintaining mental health influenced secular communities to adopt similar practices, including regular schedules, communal meals, and organized social activities. These community-based prevention programs represented early forms of public health initiatives that recognized the social dimensions of mental wellness. Medieval approaches to aging and mental health also evolved significantly during this period, as practitioners developed specialized techniques for caring for elderly individuals experiencing cognitive decline or psychological distress. The recognition that aging could affect mental function led to the development of supportive care approaches that emphasize comfort and dignity rather than cure. The medieval understanding of childhood mental health also became more sophisticated, with practitioners recognizing that children could experience psychological disorders that required specialized treatment. The development of age-appropriate interventions reflected growing awareness of developmental differences and the need for individualized care approaches. Medieval women played crucial roles in developing and implementing mental health care, particularly in monastic hospitals and urban charitable institutions. Female religious orders often specialized in caring for individuals experiencing mental distress developing innovative approaches that emphasized compassionate care and gradual rehabilitation. The contributions of medieval women to mental health care have often been overlooked by historical accounts that focus primarily on male physicians and theologians. However, recent scholarship has revealed the extensive involvement of women in all aspects of medieval medical practice, including the treatment of psychological disorders and the care of individuals experiencing mental distress. Medieval approaches to sexuality and mental health also evolved during this period as practitioners developed more nuanced understanding of the relationship between sexual behavior and psychological well-being. The rigid sexual morality of early medieval Christianity gradually gave way to more sophisticated approaches that recognize the complexity of human sexuality and its impact on mental health. The development of confession as a therapeutic practice represented another important medieval innovation that anticipated modern psychotherapy. Skilled confessors learned to help people work through psychological conflicts and traumatic experiences using techniques that resembled modern counseling approaches. The confidential nature of confession provided a safe space for people to discuss their deepest fears and concerns. Medieval pilgrimage practices also served important mental health functions, providing people with opportunities to seek healing through travel, community interaction, and spiritual renewal. The physical demands of pilgrimage, combined with the social support available at pilgrimage sites, often produced significant improvements in mental health that were attributed to miraculous intervention, but probably reflected the therapeutic benefits of exercise, social connection, and spiritual practice. The medieval period's legacy in mental health care extends far beyond the specific practices and theories developed during that time. The fundamental insights about the importance of compassionate care, community support, and holistic approaches to healing continue to influence contemporary mental health practice and remind us that effective healing requires attention to the full range of human needs and experiences. The careful attention that medieval exorcists paid to the psychological state and social circumstances of those seeking help demonstrates the importance of understanding each person's unique situation, rather than applying standardized treatments without regard for individual differences. This personalized approach required skilled practitioners who could combine theoretical knowledge with practical wisdom and genuine empathy for human suffering. The medieval recognition that some forms of distress require spiritual as well as medical intervention has been validated by contemporary research into the relationship between religious belief, social support, and mental health outcomes. People who maintain strong spiritual practices and community connections typically show better recovery rates and greater resilience in facing life's challenges. Medieval practitioners understood this connection intuitively and built it into their treatment approaches. The emphasis on hope and meaning that characterized medieval approaches to mental distress remains crucial for effective healing. Even when complete cure was impossible, medieval practitioners worked to help people find purpose and dignity within their limitations. This existential dimension of healing is often neglected in contemporary medical practice, yet it may be one of the most important factors in determining quality of life for people experiencing chronic mental illness. The medieval commitment to treating all people, regardless of their social status, the nature of their condition, or the supposed cause of their distress, with dignity and respect established principles that continue to guide ethical medical practice. The best medieval practitioners understood that their primary obligation was to relieve suffering and restore wholeness, not to judge or categorize those who came to them seeking help. As we reflect on this journey through the shadowed corridors of medieval demonology and exorcism, we find ourselves not in some foreign country of superstition and ignorance, but in a landscape that mirrors our own deepest concerns about suffering, healing, and the proper response to human distress. The medieval world may seem distant in its specific beliefs and practices, but the fundamental challenges it faced how to understand and respond to mental illness, how to maintain hope in the face of apparently overwhelming problems, how to provide effective care while preserving human dignity, remain as pressing today as they were 1,000 years ago. The candles that once lit those monastery chambers have long since guttered out, but the light they cast continues to illuminate our understanding of what it means to be human in a world where suffering is inevitable, but healing remains possible. The Latin prayers that echoed through stone corridors may no longer be heard, but the commitment they express to stand with those who suffer and to work tirelessly for their restoration continues to inspire all who dedicate themselves to the healing arts. As we draw our exploration to a close, settling deeper into the quiet comfort of these ancient insights, we find ourselves returning to those candlelit chambers where medieval practitioners first grappled with the mysteries of human suffering and the possibilities of healing. The shadows that danced on monastery walls weren't just created by flickering flames. They were the interplay of light and darkness that characterizes all human experience, the eternal struggle between despair and hope that defines our search for meaning and wholeness. The Latin words that echoed through those sacred spaces, exorciso te creatura salis per deum vivum, carry with them something more profound than ancient ritual. They represent humanity's refusal to accept that suffering is meaningless or that those who experience mental distress are beyond the reach of compassion and care. Each syllable was a declaration of faith, not just in divine power, but in the human capacity to persist, to learn, to adapt, and to find new ways of bringing healing to broken lives. The salt and water that medieval priests blessed with such careful attention weren't just religious symbols, but embodiments of the understanding that healing often begins with the simplest elements: basic care, nourishment, cleanliness, and the patient application of whatever wisdom is available. The elaborate rituals that surrounded their blessing reflected not superstition, but a sophisticated recognition that effective healing requires attention to both practical needs and psychological dimensions of human experience. Medieval communities that gathered around those experiencing mental distress demonstrated values that transcend any particular historical period. The recognition that individual suffering affects entire networks of relationships, that healing requires collective commitment, and that recovery involves not just the cessation of symptoms, but the restoration of meaning, dignity, and social connection. These insights remain as relevant today as they were when torchlight flickered against stone walls and prayers were whispered in languages that few now remember. The careful documentation that medieval monasteries maintained about their healing work provides us with more than just historical curiosity. It offers a window into the gradual development of humane approaches to mental health care that anticipate many contemporary insights. Case by case, year by year, century by century, these records show the slow accumulation of knowledge about what works in alleviating human suffering and the refinement of approaches that balance effectiveness with compassion. The failures documented in these medieval records are as instructive as the successes, reminding us that healing is always a humble art that requires acknowledgement of limits and continued openness to learning. Medieval practitioners who honestly recorded their unsuccessful attempts to help those in distress demonstrated a commitment to truth that enabled future generations to build on their experience and develop better approaches to care. The theological frameworks that medieval thinkers used to understand demonic possession and mental illness provided them with vocabularies for discussing experiences that might otherwise have been impossible to address. When someone reported hearing voices or feeling controlled by external forces, the medieval concept of spiritual influence offered a way to take these experiences seriously while maintaining hope for recovery and restoration. The gradual evolution of medieval thinking about demons and mental illness demonstrates the importance of maintaining openness to new insights while preserving valuable wisdom from the past. Medieval practitioners didn't abandon their spiritual frameworks when they began to understand medical causes of psychological distress. Instead, they integrated new knowledge into existing systems of meaning in ways that enhanced their ability to provide comprehensive care. This adaptive approach offers important lessons for our own time as we continue to grapple with questions about how different types of understanding, scientific, spiritual, psychological, social, can work together to address the full complexity of human experience. The medieval refusal to compartmentalize different dimensions of healing reminds us that effective care requires attention to the whole person and their entire environment. The monastic hospitals that emerged throughout medieval Europe represented remarkable experiments in comprehensive care that combined medical knowledge with spiritual wisdom, individual treatment with community support, and immediate intervention with long-term rehabilitation. The success of these institutions reflected their understanding that healing involves more than just addressing symptoms. It requires restoration of meaning, purpose, and social connection. The records maintained by these medieval hospitals provide invaluable insights into the development of humane approaches to mental health care. Page by page, they document the slow recognition that people experiencing psychological distress deserve not just treatment, but respect, dignity, and hope for meaningful recovery. This ethical foundation continues to influence medical practice today and reminds us that technical skill must always be guided by genuine concern for human welfare. The medieval emphasis on community involvement in healing processes offers particularly relevant insights for contemporary mental health practice. The recognition that psychological distress affects entire social networks and that recovery requires collective support has been validated by modern research. Yet many current approaches continue to focus primarily on individual intervention, while neglecting broader social and environmental factors. Medieval practitioners understood intuitively what modern research has confirmed, that people who maintain strong social connections and community support typically show better outcomes in recovering from mental illness and greater resilience in facing life's challenges. Their treatment approaches built this understanding into every aspect of care, from initial evaluation through long-term rehabilitation and community reintegration. The careful attention that medieval exorcists and healers paid to the unique circumstances of each person seeking help demonstrates the importance of individualized care that takes into account not just symptoms, but personal history, social context, and cultural background. This personalized approach required practitioners who could combine theoretical knowledge with practical wisdom and genuine empathy for human suffering. The medieval commitment to treating all people, regardless of their social status, the nature of their condition, or the supposed cause of their distress, with dignity and respect established principles that continue to guide ethical medical practice. The best medieval practitioners understood that their primary obligation was to relieve suffering and restore wholeness, not to judge or categorize those who came to them seeking help. Perhaps most importantly, medieval approaches to mental illness and demonic possession remind us that healing is never just about technique or knowledge, but about the fundamentally human qualities of patience, compassion, and hope. The practitioners who worked in those candlelit chambers understood that effective healing requires not just professional skill, but genuine care for the whole person and unwavering commitment to their welfare and recovery. As the last echoes of our journey through medieval demonology and exorcism fade into the gentle silence of this moment, we carry with us insights that transcend any particular historical period or cultural context. The challenges that medieval practitioners faced, how to understand and respond to mental suffering, how to maintain hope in apparently hopeless situations, how to provide effective care while preserving human dignity remain as pressing today as they were 1,000 years ago. The candles that once illuminated those monastery chambers may have long since been extinguished, but the light they cast continues to guide all who dedicate themselves to the healing arts. The Latin prayers that echoed through stone corridors may no longer be heard, but the commitment they express to stand with those who suffer and work tirelessly for their restoration continues to inspire contemporary practitioners who understand that healing is both a science and a calling. In the profound quiet of this moment, as we settle into the peace that comes from understanding our connection to those who came before us, we can feel the presence of all those medieval healers whose patient work laid the foundation for our current knowledge about mental health and human resilience. Their legacy lives on not just in the techniques they developed or the knowledge they accumulated, but in the values they embodied and the commitment they demonstrated to the fundamental dignity and worth of every human being. The demons that haunted medieval imagination may have different names in our time, but they represent the same forces that threaten human flourishing in every age: despair, isolation, meaninglessness, and the loss of hope. The weapons that medieval practitioners used to combat these forces, patience, compassion, community support, and unwavering commitment to healing, remain as powerful today as they were when incense burned in chapel corners and prayers were offered by candlelight. And so, as we rest in the wisdom gained from this exploration of medieval approaches to mental distress and spiritual healing, we find ourselves not in some foreign country of ancient superstition, but in familiar territory, where the deepest human concerns about suffering and recovery, isolation and connection, despair and hope continue to shape our understanding of what it means to care for one another with skill, compassion, and enduring love. The silence that now surrounds us is not empty, but full of the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the echoes of prayers offered and tears shed, the memories of healing accomplished and hope restored. In this silence, we can hear the whisper of ancient insights that continue to illuminate our path toward understanding and alleviating human suffering in our own complex and challenging time, reminding us that the most powerful healing always begins with the simple decision to stand with those who suffer and to offer whatever comfort, skill, and hope we possess in service of their recovery and restoration to wholeness.